Hi, it's Dr. Brown. So today, as you approach revising, drafting and revising your papers and your speeches for Power 2, and for everyone else that's watching that's been working on a project, I want to go through a few extra tips, lessons, and reminders that can help you really bring the research that you've been doing to a polished and conclusive culmination. So we can call this some miscellaneous writing wisdom. So the first thing I want to remind us is just what it means to make an argument. An argument consists of two pieces. It consists of a claim and it consists of evidence. So we can think about what happens when one of these two pieces are missing. So if you're just giving evidence after evidence after evidence and you're leaving people asking, what's the point, right? It sounds a little bit like a ramble, right? So sometimes we see evidence with no claim. On the contrary, when we just see claim after claim after claim and there's no evidence, that's also a problem, right? It can be a rant or a polemic, and it leads people asking, okay, that's a fine argument, but where is the evidence to defend it? Right, so to make a strong argument, you need both pieces. You need your strong claim, usually a thesis statement, that gets defended in paragraph after paragraph through analysis of the evidence. And I think it's important to remember that evidence doesn't just speak for itself. You can't just plop it there and expect that everyone's going to agree with you. Car alarm outside. But you can't just expect everyone's going to agree with you. You have to actually analyze the evidence and make the connection to your claim and show how the evidence defends your claim. It's also important for us to remember that our claims emerge from doing our research. So you might have a sense of your argument at the beginning of your paper, but you really should stay in that mindset of research question until you have finished analyzing your evidence, whether that's through close reading, whether you did a survey and analyzed the survey results, or you analyzed interview responses. If you're in the sciences in a different course than mine and you're analyzing data, you start with a hypothesis, but you still want to keep that spirit of questioning as you do analysis. And then you figure out what your claim is. I think something that's complicated for students that are writing under Western genre conventions is that the writing process that I just described suggests that you're really going to discover your argument at the end of your piece. And so a lot of times, when I work in the writing center with students and I only have half an hour or an hour with them, and they're struggling to figure out what their argument is, even though they might have a thesis statement at the beginning of their paper, I often flip to the ending, because oftentimes the best statement of a thesis statement is actually in the conclusion, because you've written the whole draft and then by the end you really know what you have discovered. I think this is an important moment when cultural awareness of genre conventions come in. There are lots of cultures and nations where theses actually are stated at the end of the piece. So in Germany, I think that's the case. The Sri Lankan scholar Kanagaraja talks about how that's the case in Sri Lanka, and actually how if you make your case too obvious in Sri Lankan academic discourse, it's almost thought of as talking down to your reader, like they can't put two and two together. But in the West, in American academia, in our capitalist academic context, we really insist on our arguments and our findings from the beginning. And so there's a tension there between the conventions of the finished piece and actually the writing process and the process of discovery, because it is natural for your claim to really be firmest at the end, but you need to use the writing process to get that finding and get that material back to the beginning of your paper for your reader. So I think a really good analogy is a lawyer in a court case. A lawyer doesn't come into the court and talk through all their evidence and figure out what they think you should choose for your verdict by the end of their arguments, right? They don't finish and say, so I guess after all that evidence, I guess he seems not guilty. So please find him not guilty, right? They do their preparation in advance so that they can walk in on day one of the trial and say, I'm going to show you a series of pieces of evidence and you're going to hear key testimony showing you why my client is innocent. And then they take you through the evidence, right? And so they did their preparation in advance. And I think that's a really good analogy for the difference between the structure of your paper or your speech, which should have your argument known and stated from the beginning and then defended and fleshed out, versus the writing process, which is mirrored in some other cultural contexts, where you work through your evidence with your reader together and you come to the conclusion together at the end. That's not how we do it in the States. So you really need to find that finding through your methods and revise it to the front of your paper and restate it and defend it throughout. So that's enough about the writing process. I also want to get us thinking a little bit more about citations and about using our sources today. So just like DJs, we as scholars are in conversation with our sources, and we're also in conversation with the disciplines that they're from. So when we make our citations, when we quote people, we are showing what sources we care about. We're showing that we know what other people have already written about our topic. We're showing that we know what part of the university and what part of discourse we're coming from, right? Are we working in the humanities? Are we working in the social sciences? Are we working in the hard sciences? Are we in engineering? Each of these areas of the university have their own way of presenting with and engaging their sources. They also have their own use of methods, their own assumptions, right? So when we're talking about other sources, we're also locating ourselves and we're locating our study. And I want to pause for a second actually on citation methods. I think citation methods are often thought of as just rules, arbitrary rules that you have to follow. But even choosing between MLA style and APA style actually has some rhetorical functions for your own reader, and it also locates you in the academy as well. So MLA style is organized by a group of scholars called the Modern Language Association. And so this is a conference and an association that your English professors, your French or Spanish language professors would all attend and be members of. And the way that MLA encourages you to cite prioritizes the eternity of texts, and it also prioritizes authors. So MLA gives authors whole names, and it also doesn't prioritize the year of publication. So it keeps that information in the works cited page, right? So to someone citing their sources in MLA style, something written by Plato thousands of years ago and something written by Trisha Rose 30 years ago can directly be in dialogue with each other, even across the span of centuries. And so you can see MLA style examples right here. APA style is published by the American Psychological Association, right? So they are creating standards for scientists and social scientists. And so APA style privileges recentness, right? So when you are writing using APA style, you're always putting the year that the text was published inside of your sentences right there with your citation so that your reader knows right away how recent the work you're citing is. Something else that's different about APA style is that they list authors using their initials only so that you can't make gender inferences from people's first names. And you can see that listed below as well. But when it comes to actually working with sources, it can be really complicated. And a lot of times teachers just teach these little rules, but they don't talk about the difficulty and the cognitive work of understanding the sources that you're using and really integrating insights from those sources into your own work. So I want to bring in some examples from a study that has really inspired me a lot, and that was written by a scholar that I worked with, Rebecca Moore Howard, when I was a doctoral student at Syracuse University. So in their study, Writing from Sources, Writing from Sentences, Howard and her co-authors study papers written by real freshman writers. And in their study, they look specifically at all of the writers' use of citations and sources in the papers that they turned in. And so to complete this study, Becky, Trish, and Tanya actually looked through every single citation of all the papers that they studied to really understand better how the student writers were using the sources that they said they were using through their citations. And so Becky and her co-authors categorized the students' use of sources in one of four ways. So the first one was summary, where the write-up of the sources was shorter by 50% or more than the original passage that the student was referencing. Paraphrase, where the student was using new language, but it didn't get any shorter. Patch writing, which is a term that Dr. Howard actually coined, referred to places where student writers were trying to paraphrase, but they didn't get everything into their own words. And so they were still using too many of the source's original language without quotation marks. And then finally, the study also noted copying. So places where the writers used exact language from the original source, whether or not they put that in quotation marks, as they should have whenever you're directly copying language. And so here in the panel on the left, you can see some examples of places where students patch wrote, right? They tried to use their own words, but they didn't fully use their own words. And there are still places where key terms could have been put in quotation marks, or the students just changed the grammar a little bit to make it seem different. But this isn't really acceptable academic citation practice yet. And I'll give you a second to look at some of the examples that Howard offers. And so on the right here, we have the study's findings. So they looked at 18 papers, and I think the findings are really interesting. 16 out of 18 papers had some patch writing, so places where students weren't using their own language enough. 100% of papers have some paraphrase. 0% of papers had any summary. And in numbers 4 and 5 here, we see that while 14 out of 18 papers had some use of direct language from original source texts, 13 out of the 14 had some quotation that was not marked correctly. In number 6 and 7, we also see some misuse of sources or under-sourcing. So 17 out of 18 papers had some information that was not cited at all that ought to have been. And 14 out of 18 papers cited a source that the information they were citing was not in that source. I think what's most important here is that summary wasn't apparent at all in any of the papers. But if you look closely at the sources that you're studying, the scholarly papers that you're quoting and using yourself, you'll find that summary happens all the time, and that usually a quotation is only given when the scholar either needs to show a piece of evidence for their own claim, and so show how it was said originally, or when the original source said something so well or so perfectly or established key terms for a conversation that it's appropriate to use their own words. So what Becky's scholarship really points to for me is that summary is extremely difficult, and she has actually spoken about this as well. Summary is extremely difficult, and summary is actually an advanced level skill. And so the reason that her paper is called Writing from Sources, Writing for Sentences is because she and her co-authors ultimately concluded that freshman writers were over-relying on the language of their sources because they didn't understand them well enough to write them in their own words or to summarize them in their own words. And so this study to me is a reminder to, when you're working with language and if you're struggling to get stuff into your own language, to really invest in the practice of rereading and in reading comprehension, because this isn't simple. These are not easy texts that you're writing about, and it takes a lot of work to actually understand them and synthesize them and contextualize a quotation in an overall argument, for example, in just a sentence or two. So really give yourself time and space to understand and dig into the concepts that you're working with, to consult a dictionary, to consult a Wikipedia article or a book review that can help you make sense of what you're reading. The other thing I think this reminds us is that good use of citations starts with your note-taking practices and should be embedded throughout the writing and research process. And so even though in my class we're late in the quarter now, I really encourage you, if you're struggling with language level issues in citation, to think back also to your note-taking practices and your earlier research practices, because it's really important to take notes that are very careful about quotations to make sure that any words that are from the text are in quotations from the first time you put them in your notes, that you get that page number written down so that you can keep track of what are the author's words and what are your own. So to conclude with, I just want to remind you that everything that we're working on is a skill. There's a reason that these classes are required. It's because writing at a university level of research and argumentation is really difficult, and it's really different than what we did in high school. And also just to remind you that the writing process, the creative process, the design process, they do work. There's a reason that so many of your instructors emphasize the process and the process of discovery. And that's why we need to give ourselves time to draft, time to let others read our work, and time to revise. And I just always like to remember people that I'm working with that these are even strategies that I still use in my own writing. And I think for professional writers, writing doesn't get easy. It's always hard. The first thing that I write down is always wrong. But what I've learned over the years is to trust the process and to know that if I keep going through the process, I will get where I'm trying to go. So good luck, and here's to the work ahead of you.